Some secrets don't die with the people we love. They linger in hidden places, calling out to us. For 10 years, Eveline Drayton believed her husband had taken his final truths to the grave. Then she found the letters. Tucked away in the attic, they spoke of a cabin that should not exist. She followed his words into the Colorado mountains, far from any trail, to a cliff's edge where the cabin stood waiting. The door was ajar, a lit lamp glowing from within. Her favorite blanket was folded on the porch rail. The tools hung on the wall, arranged exactly as she always kept them. It was as if someone had been living there, keeping everything in a state of perfect readiness. But her husband had been dead for a decade. So who then was waiting for her? Before we continue, we'd love to know where you're listening from. And if this story moves you, make sure you subscribe, because we have something very special in store for you tomorrow. The morning sun cast long shadows across Eveline Drayton's homestead, painting the weathered fence posts in shades of amber and gold. She stood on the porch, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands, watching the eastern hills emerge from the morning mist. She had done this for 10 years, standing in this exact spot, her coffee forgotten, watching the dawn arrive without James by her side. The house behind her grew quieter with each passing year. It wasn't just the absence of his voice or his footsteps on the floorboards, but something deeper. It was the way a place loses its soul when half its purpose walks out the door and never returns. She kept everything just as it was. His coat still hung by the door. His boots were tucked under the bench where he'd left them that last morning before setting out for the mountains. She told herself it wasn't a shrine, just an inability to make the final, severing cut that would come with putting his things away. Redwood, Colorado, had once been their dream. A frontier town carved into the eastern slope of the Rockies, small enough that everyone knew your name, but large enough for a general store, a church, and a doctor's office. They had arrived 23 years ago with little more than determination and each other. They claimed 160 acres under the Homestead Act and built their life from the ground up. James had been 32 then, strong as an ox and twice as stubborn. She was 28, a Missouri farm girl with no fear of hard work. They met at a barn dance in St. Joseph, married 3 months later against her father's wishes, and headed west in a wagon filled with tools and hope. The first years were lean. Drought, hard winters, crops that failed more often than they took. But they weathered it all together, their bond forged stronger by every hardship. She remembered the way he'd look at her across the dinner table after a particularly grueling day, his weathered face breaking into that crooked smile that had stolen her heart. "We're still standing, Eve," he'd say. "That's what matters. We're still standing." The nickname made her chest ache, even now. No one had called her Eve since the day they buried him. Their neighbors had been kind. Gideon Marsh, the old rancher whose property bordered theirs to the north, had helped her with the heavy work that first year. He'd show up unannounced with his 2 sons to mend fences or haul hay, never accepting payment beyond a cup of coffee and a slice of whatever she'd been baking. He was in his 70s now, his sons mostly running the ranch, but he still stopped by once a week to check on her. "You're too young to be rattling around this place alone," he'd said more than once. "James wouldn't have wanted you to live like this." But she could never explain to Gideon that being alone was the only way she knew how to live now. The grief had hollowed her out, and she had filled the emptiness with routine and self-reliance. She ran the homestead, kept chickens, tended a garden, and traded eggs and vegetables for supplies in town. It was a small life, but it was hers, and it didn't require her to pretend the wound had healed when it never would. Temperance Cole ran the general store her father had built 30 years ago. Only 25, she had a cheerful disposition that sometimes grated on Evelyn's more somber nature, but she was good-hearted and never pried. When Evelyn came to town for supplies, Temperance would fill her order with brisk efficiency and a line of pleasant chatter that never veered into uncomfortable territory. She seemed to understand that some people needed their privacy respected. Dr. Vernon Cross was another matter. He had arrived in Redwood about 15 years back, setting up his practice in a small building on Main Street and quickly making himself indispensable. He was competent, professional, and utterly unreadable. When James died, it was Vernon who had examined the body. He had written the death certificate and explained to Evelyn, in his calm, clinical manner, that her husband had fallen from a cliff while scouting in the high country. A tragic accident, nothing more. Evelyn had never warmed to Vernon Cross. There was something in his eyes that remained distant, even when he was attempting to be compassionate. He offered her laudanum for the grief, which she refused. He checked on her twice in the following months. Professional visits, he'd said, to ensure she wasn't succumbing to melancholy. She had tolerated his concern and seen him to the door as politely as she could. The day that changed everything began like any other. She was cleaning the attic, a task she'd put off for months, sorting through the old trunks and boxes that had accumulated over 2 decades of marriage. Motes of dust danced in the single sunbeam slanting through the small window. The heat was oppressive, and she worked in her oldest dress, hair tied up in a kerchief, sweat beading at her collar. She was prying up a few loose floorboards to check for rot when her fingers brushed against something that didn't belong. A packet wrapped in oilcloth, wedged in the space between the joists. Her heart began to pound before she even knew why. Some primal instinct recognizing that hidden things are hidden for a reason. The oilcloth was tied with twine, the knot pulled tight. She had to fetch a pair of scissors to cut it. Inside were letters, at least 20 of them, all in James's hand. They were not addressed to anyone. They were not meant to be sent. They were a record, a kind of journal, each one dated. The first was from 18 months before his death. Her hands trembled as she read his familiar script, his voice so clear in her mind, it was as if he were speaking to her across the 10-year chasm. "If you are reading this," the first letter began, "then I've failed in my promise to tell you everything before the end. I'm sorry, Eve. I know how much secrets have cost us in the past, but this time, the secret might be the only thing that keeps you safe." She sat there in the sweltering heat of the attic, reading letter after letter, her understanding of everything she thought she knew crumbling with every page. James had been building something in the mountains. A cabin, he called it, though his descriptions suggested something more. A refuge, a sanctuary, a place no one else knew existed. He had been working on it for the last year and a half of his life, slipping away on days he told her he was hunting or checking boundary markers. He had been meticulous, hauling supplies across difficult terrain, choosing a location so remote that even seasoned trappers would never stumble upon it. But why? The letters danced around the question, offering hints but never a direct answer. He wrote of feeling watched, of needing a place that was truly secure, of making preparations for a time that was coming. There were references to our place, as if he were building it for both of them. And yet, he had never said a word. The last letter was the most unsettling. The cabin is finished. I've stocked it with everything we'll need. Food, water, firewood, even some of your favorite books. I keep thinking I should take you there, show you what I've built, but every time I start to tell you, something stops me. It's not fear, exactly. It's more a certainty that once I bring you into this, there's no turning back. You'll be part of whatever comes next. Maybe that's selfish. Maybe I should trust you to make the choice. I'm running out of time to decide. It was dated 1 week before he died. She read them all twice, searching for clearer explanations but finding only more questions. Why had he felt the need for such secrecy? What was he preparing for? And most disturbingly, how had she never seen the weight he was carrying in those final months? But she had seen it. That was what stung the most as she sat there, his words scattered around her like fallen leaves. She had seen him grow distant, preoccupied. She had seen the way he'd startle at sudden noises, the way his eyes would scan the tree line when he thought she wasn't looking. She had seen it, and she had said nothing, respecting what she thought was his need for space, his way of wrestling with whatever troubled him. Now she wondered if her silence had been respect or cowardice. If she had pushed, demanded answers, would he have told her? Would it have changed anything? The final item in the oilcloth packet was a map, hand-drawn on the back of a letter. It showed landmarks she recognized. The distinct triple peak of Morgan's Crown to the west, the Clearwater River running south, and a spot marked with a simple X beside James's handwriting. Our place. Follow the deer trail from Widow's Gap. She came down from the attic at sunset, the letters and the map in her hands, her head spinning. She made tea she didn't drink. She sat at the kitchen table until the room grew dark around her, then finally lit a lamp and read the letters one more time. At midnight, she made her decision. She would find that cabin. She would see what James had built and try to understand what had driven him to such secrecy. Maybe there would be answers there. Or maybe she would find only an empty structure and more questions. Either way, she could not let it go. The grief she had learned to live with had cracked open, and beneath it was a desperate need to know, to truly know the man she had buried. She spent the next 2 days preparing. She told Gideon she was going to visit a cousin in Boulder, a lie that slipped out with surprising ease. She packed a week's worth of supplies, though she hoped to be back sooner. She filled her saddlebags with food, a bedroll, her rifle, ammunition, and the letters. She studied the map until she could see it with her eyes closed. On the morning she left, she stood on the porch one last time with her coffee, watching the sunrise, and whispered to the empty air, "I'm going to find your secret, James. Whatever it is, I'm ready to know." She wasn't ready, not even close, but she swung herself onto her horse and turned its head toward the mountains anyway. Because some truths have to be faced, ready or not. The journey into the mountains took 2 full days of hard riding. Eveline followed James's map with the kind of focus that comes from having nothing else to hold on to. The terrain grew rougher the higher she climbed, the well-worn paths giving way to game trails, and then to no trails at all. Her horse, a sturdy mare named Patience, picked her way carefully over loose rock and through dense stands of pine. The first night, she made camp beside a small creek, the water running clear and cold over smooth stones. She built a small fire, more for comfort than for warmth. The summer nights were cool at this altitude, but not cold. She ate jerky and hardtack, drank from the creek, and lay in her bedroll, staring up at stars so numerous and bright, they felt close enough to touch. She had been in these mountains before, years ago, when she and James were still exploring the land around their homestead. There was a particular lookout he had loved, a place where eagles nested on the cliff face and you could see for miles across the valleys below. He had taken her there during their second summer in Colorado, spread a blanket on the sun-warmed rock, and they had spent the afternoon watching the eagles soar. "I could stay here forever," he had told her, taking her hand. "Just you and me and the sky." She had laughed at his romanticism. "We'd starve in a week." "Details," he'd said, kissing her temple. "Why do you always have to be so practical?" The memory made her throat tighten. She rolled onto her side in the bedroll, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and forced herself to think of the next day's route instead of the past. The morning came with the song of birds and mist rising from the creek. She ate a cold breakfast, broke camp with practiced efficiency, and was riding again before the sun had fully crested the eastern peaks. According to the map, Widow's Gap was another 4 hours north and west, following the creek upstream to where it narrowed and eventually vanished into a jumble of granite boulders. She found the pass shortly after noon. It was exactly as James had drawn it, a narrow slit between two enormous rock faces, barely wide enough for a horse and rider. The name came from a widow who had tried to cross the mountains in winter some 30 years ago and had perished in a blizzard somewhere in these passes. Eveline had heard the story from the town elders, though the details varied depending on who was telling it. The deer trail James had marked on the map was the hardest to find. She had to dismount and search on foot, leading her horse, Patience, along the base of the cliff until she spotted what might have been a path, a slight depression in the rocky ground. A few branches were bent in a way that suggested regular passage. It was the kind of trail you wouldn't notice unless you knew to look for it. The path climbed steeply, winding up the eastern face of the cliff. In places, Eveline had to coax Patience over obstacles that made the mare snort with displeasure. The sun beat down on them without mercy, and soon both rider and horse were slick with sweat. Despite the cool mountain air, as they ascended, Eveline's mind drifted back to the final months before James's death. Now, she could see, with the clarity that comes from distance and discovery, just how much he had changed. He started coming home later from his rides, always with reasonable explanations. A fence that needed more work than expected, a difficult stretch of terrain that slowed him down, a hunt that took him farther than he'd intended. She'd accepted the explanations because she trusted him. In 21 years of marriage, he had never given her a reason not to. But there had been other, more subtle changes. The way he would pause before answering a simple question, as if weighing what he could safely say. The nights she would wake to find him standing at the window, staring out into the darkness. The tension in his shoulders that never fully relaxed, even when they were alone. "Are you all right?" she had asked him once, about a month before he died. They were sitting on the porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the clouds in shades of crimson and gold. He had looked at her with an expression she couldn't decipher, something between love and sorrow, and a terrible, weary resignation. "I'm fine, Eve, just tired." "You've been tired for weeks. It's the time of year. So much to do before winter." She let it drop because pressing James when he wasn't ready to talk only made him retreat further. She'd learned that early in their marriage. He always came around eventually, sharing what troubled him in his own time. Except, he had run out of time. The trail finally leveled out onto a narrow ledge that ran along the cliff face. She stopped to let Patience rest and check the map. According to James's markings, the cabin should be close now, less than a mile ahead, at a point where the ledge widened and the cliff face curved back, forming a natural amphitheater. She drank from her canteen, gave Patience water from her hat, and moved on. The ledge was wide enough to feel secure, but narrow enough that she kept her eyes on the path rather than the drop below. The rock face to her left was warm from the sun, streaked with mineral deposits in shades of rust, ochre, and deep purple. Then she rounded a bend in the cliff face and saw it. The cabin, nestled on a wide shelf of rock that jutted out from the mountainside like a natural balcony. It was small, 1 or 2 rooms at most, built from logs that had weathered to a silver gray. The construction was solid, sturdy, the kind of work that showed skill and patience. But what stole Evelyn's breath wasn't the cabin itself. It was the smoke curling from its chimney. She froze in the saddle, staring at the thin wisp of gray smoke unspooling into the blue sky. Someone was there. Someone was in James's secret cabin right now. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her first instinct was to turn back, to ride down the mountain and pretend she'd never found this place. But even as the thought formed, she was swinging down from the saddle, tethering Patience to a stunted pine growing from a crack in the rock, and checking that her rifle was loaded. She approached the cabin slowly, her boots silent on the stone. As she drew closer, details emerged that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. There was her blanket, the blue and white one she had woven 5 winters ago, folded neatly on the porch bench. She had searched for that blanket for weeks after it went missing, finally concluding she must have left it somewhere in town. The tools hanging on pegs beside the door were arranged exactly as she would have arranged them, not as James would have. He was careless with tools, hanging them wherever there was space. She was the one who insisted the hammer go next to the saw, the axe beside the wedge, everything in its logical place. A bucket of fresh water sat by the door, the surface still shimmering, as if someone had just set it down. The door was slightly ajar. Evelyn brought the rifle to her shoulder, her finger resting alongside the trigger guard, not yet on the trigger itself. She'd been raised around guns and knew not to risk an accidental discharge. She moved to the side of the door, listening. No sound from within. No movement. Just the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant call of a hawk. "Hello," she called out, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I know you're in there. I'm armed. Come on out so I can see you." Nothing. She waited a full minute, then another. The smoke still rose from the chimney. Whoever had been here must have heard her approach and fled. But why leave the fire burning? Why not bar the door? She nudged it open with her boot, rifle raised, scanning the interior. The cabin was empty. One room, as she'd guessed, with a sleeping loft above, a wood stove in the corner with a pot of what smelled like coffee still steaming on top. A table, 2 chairs, shelves of neatly arranged supplies. A cot along one wall with quilts she recognized. She'd made them herself and donated them to a charity drive years ago, during a spring cleaning. But it was the items on the table that made her lower the rifle with trembling fingers. A tin cup, still warm to the touch. Beside it, a plate with breadcrumbs on it. Someone had eaten recently, perhaps only minutes before she arrived. And next to the plate, a leather-bound journal, closed, with a pencil lying on top. Evelyn picked up the journal, her hands shaking, and opened it to the first page. James's familiar script filled the pages, with dates going back a year and a half, just as the letters had indicated. Daily entries about building the cabin, notes on supplies, observations about the weather and wildlife. But these entries didn't stop 10 years ago with his death. The most recent entry was dated yesterday. Evelyn's knees gave out. She sat down hard in the chair, the journal clutched to her chest, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. It wasn't possible. She had buried James. She had stood by his grave and watched his coffin be lowered into the ground. Vernon Cross had examined the body, confirmed his identity. What was left of it, after the fall that had killed him? This had to be a trick. Someone was playing a cruel prank. But who? Who else knew about this cabin? She forced herself to read the latest entry, her eyes struggling to focus through the tears that blurred her vision. Weather's turning. Need to bring in more firewood before the first snow. Saw a mountain lion on the south trail yesterday. A big male. Probably the same one I saw last spring. He didn't seem interested in me. Just passing through. Keep thinking about Eve, wondering if she's all right. It's been 10 years. Hope she's found some peace. Hope she's not still angry with me for leaving the way I did. But I couldn't tell her. Couldn't risk bringing her into this. Catherine's men are still looking, still watching. As long as they think I'm dead, she's safe. That has to be enough. The journal fell from her hands, thudding onto the floorboards with a sound that seemed too loud in the silent cabin. James was alive. Evelyn sat in the chair for minutes, or maybe hours. Her mind was a white noise of shock and disbelief. The journal lay where it had fallen, splayed open on the floor. The coffee on the stove had stopped steaming. The light slanting through the window had shifted, suggesting time was passing, even if she felt suspended outside of it. James was alive. The words made no sense, no matter how many times she repeated them in her head. She had mourned him, wept over his grave. She had spent 10 years learning how to live in a world without him. And all that time he was here, living in this secret cabin, writing in his journal, hiding from her. The grief that had defined her for a decade transmuted in an instant into something else. A searing rage that made her hands tremble and her vision narrow. He let her believe he was dead. Let her bury the body Vernon Cross identified as his. Let her suffer through every lonely day and sleepless night for 10 years, while he was alive and breathing and drinking coffee in this cabin. She shot to her feet, knocking the chair over backwards. She wanted to throw something, to break something, to scream into the mountain air until her throat was raw. Instead, she paced the small cabin like a caged animal, her boots thudding on the wooden floor. Why? Why would he do this to her? The journal. The answers had to be in the journal. She snatched it from the floor, forcing herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly through the rage and confusion churning inside her. She sat again, righting the chair first, and began to read from the beginning. The first entries were about building the cabin. James had been methodical, detailing each step of the process, the challenges of hauling materials up the mountain, the satisfaction of seeing the structure take shape. There was love in these entries, a pride in his handiwork. He described it as our sanctuary, as if he had always intended for her to be a part of it. But there were other things woven into those early entries. Mentions of being followed in town. A strange rider asking too many questions about their property. Tools disappearing from the barn, only to mysteriously reappear. Small things that individually meant nothing, but together suggested someone was watching, testing, probing. 3 months into the journal, the tone shifted. Saw him today. Cyrus Wade. He was across the street from the general store, watching our wagon while Eve was inside. Same dead eyes I remembered from the mine. He didn't try to hide. He wanted me to see him. Wanted me to know he was back. I thought Kettering would have forgotten about me after all these years. I was wrong. Evelyn's hands tightened on the journal. Cyrus Wade. The name meant nothing to her. And who was Kettering? She read on, now desperate to understand, even as each page deepened the mystery. James wrote of old fears resurfacing, of a past he thought he'd left behind, catching up to him. He mentioned the Silver Ridge mine more than once, and each time he did, his writing grew tighter, more controlled, as if the memory itself demanded he suppress his emotions. Eve doesn't know about Silver Ridge. I never told her what happened there, what I saw. I let her believe I left the sheriff's department because I was tired of the work, wanted a quieter life. Part of that was true, but the real reason was Kettering's threat. If I testified, everyone I loved would pay the price. So I didn't. I kept my mouth shut, turned in my badge and ran. And I've been looking over my shoulder ever since. The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow. James had been a deputy when they'd met. She knew that. But he'd quit a year before they were married, saying he wanted to focus on building their homestead. She'd never questioned it. She had been so in love with him, so excited about their future together, that she had accepted his explanation without a second thought. What else didn't she know about the man she had married? The entries continued, chronicling James's mounting paranoia. He began to vary his routes into town, constantly looking over his shoulder, sleeping with a loaded rifle beside the bed. He mentioned finding tracks near their property that belonged to no neighbor or known traveler. One entry described spotting a man with binoculars, watching the property from a distant ridge. I'm building this cabin for Eve. If Kettering's men come for me, she needs a place to run, somewhere they won't find. I'm stocking it with supplies, enough for months if need be. I'll show it to her when it's done. Explain everything. Make her promise she'll come here if something happens to me. She'll be angry I kept it from her for so long. She'll be furious when she learns about Silver Ridge, but at least she'll be alive. Except he never showed her the cabin. He died, or disappeared, before he could keep that promise. Evelyn turned the page and found a loose sheet of paper tucked between the journal entries. It was a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The date printed at the top, September 14th, 1865, 15 years ago. The headline read, 7 Dead in Silver Ridge Mine Collapse. Investigation underway. She read the article carefully. The mine, located some 40 miles west of Ridgewood, was one of the richest silver deposits in the territory. The collapse had occurred during a night shift, trapping 7 miners in a tunnel that flooded from an underground spring. None of the men survived. The mine's owner, Roland Kettering, expressed his deepest condolences and promised a full investigation. The article mentioned Deputy James Drayton as the lead investigator. There was a second clipping dated 2 weeks later. Silver Ridge mine disaster ruled accidental, no criminal charges filed. And a third, dated a month after that. Deputy Drayton resigns, citing personal reasons. Evelyn set the clippings aside and continued reading the journal. James had dedicated several entries to explaining what the newspaper articles didn't, what he had discovered during his investigation, and why he had ultimately remained silent. The mine collapse hadn't been an accident. James had found evidence of deliberate sabotage. Support beams had been partially sawn through, with drill holes suggesting someone knew exactly where to weaken the tunnel's structure. But more damning than that, he had uncovered proof of embezzlement. Roland Kettering had been skimming profits from the mine for years, falsifying records, hiding the theft from his investors. The 7 men who died were witnesses. They had seen the discrepancies in ore shipments, noticed the numbers didn't add up. One of them, a man named Samuel Gray, had been keeping his own ledger, planning to report Kettering to the territorial authorities. James found Gray's records hidden in his widow's home. He had gathered enough evidence to prove both the embezzlement and the deliberate nature of the collapse. He was preparing to arrest Kettering when the mine owner made him an offer. Disappear, or everyone you love dies. Your mother in St. Louis, your sister in Denver, that pretty girl you're courting. Eveline, isn't it? Accidents are so easy to arrange. Think carefully before you make your choice. James chose silence. He destroyed most of the evidence, resigned his commission, and left town within a week. He married Eveline 2 months later, never telling her why he'd really left the law, never mentioning the threat that hung over their heads. For 14 years, he believed the threat had faded. Kettering got away with murder and theft. The case went cold. Life went on. Until Cyrus Wade showed up in Ridgewood, watching their house, making sure James remembered that Kettering never forgot. The journal entries from the last few months were painful to read. James was torn between telling Eveline everything and protecting her through ignorance. He wrote pages debating with himself, weighing the risks, trying to find a path that would keep her safe. In the end, he chose the cabin. He chose secrecy. He finished building their refuge and planned to bring her there, to explain everything, to make sure she knew where to run if the worst happened. The last entry before his supposed death was dated 3 days before his funeral. Tomorrow, I'm telling Tobias everything. He's the only one I can trust. If Kettering's men come for me, Tobias will get Eve to safety. I should have done this months ago. I was a fool, thinking I could handle this alone, thinking I could protect her by keeping her in the dark. Tomorrow, I'll tell Tobias. Tomorrow, I'll start to make things right. Eveline closed the journal, her hands trembling. Tobias Queen. She knew that name. He had been James's partner when they were both deputies. She'd met him a few times in the early years of their marriage, before James left the sheriff's department. A quiet, serious man, utterly loyal to James. She hadn't seen him in years, didn't even know he was still in the area. But apparently, he'd been here all along, keeping James's secrets, maintaining this cabin, waiting for her to find the truth. The afternoon light was fading as Eveline finally set the journal aside and began a more thorough search of the cabin. The initial shock was giving way to something harder, a cold determination to uncover every piece of the truth James had hidden from her. If he was alive, if he had orchestrated this elaborate deception, then she would find out everything, every secret, every lie. She started with the shelves. They were well stocked with supplies, canned goods, dried beans, flour, salt, coffee, enough to last for months, perhaps longer with rationing. She recognized some of the containers from her own pantry, things that had gone missing over the years that she had chalked up to her own forgetfulness. Under the bed, she found a wooden crate containing ammunition, a spare rifle, and a revolver she recognized as having belonged to James's father. He'd told her it had been lost during one of their moves. Apparently not. The loft above was accessible by a ladder built into the wall. Eveline climbed up, her head emerging into a space just tall enough to sit upright. There was a bedroll up here, neatly folded, and several books, including 3 she'd been reading before they mysteriously vanished. A lantern hung from a hook on a ceiling beam, and in the corner, wrapped in oilcloth just like the letters in the attic, she found a carved wooden box. She recognized the box immediately. James had made it in the second year of their marriage, carved with an intricate pattern of leaves and vines. He'd given it to her for their anniversary, and she had kept her most precious belongings in it. Her mother's wedding ring, letters from her sister, a lock of their dead daughter Nat's hair. It had disappeared from their bedroom 5 years ago, and Eveline had been devastated by the loss. Now here it was, hidden in the loft of a secret cabin. Its presence was more proof that James had been planning this for far longer than she had imagined. She carried it carefully down the ladder and set it on the table. The lid opened smoothly, the hinges still sound. Inside she found her mother's ring and the other personal items, all carefully preserved. But there were new additions, things he had added, more newspaper clippings, more than the ones tucked into his journal. She spread them across the table, arranging them by date. They told a story that made her blood run cold. The first was the article about the Silver Ridge mine collapse. The subsequent articles detailed the investigation, the official ruling of accidental death, and James's resignation. But there were others, dated years later. Silver Ridge Mine reopens under new management. Kettering expands operations. Territorial Governor appoints Kettering to Mine Safety Commission. Kettering named Businessman of the Year. The man who had murdered 7 miners and threatened James into silence had not only escaped justice but had prospered. He'd become powerful, influential, well-connected. There was another, more recent clipping, dated only 2 years ago. Deputy found dead in apparent suicide. The article was brief, offering few details beyond the deputy's name, William Garrett, and the location where his body had been found. But someone had circled the name in red ink and written in the margin that he had been investigating Kettering. Eveline's hands grew cold. How many people had Kettering killed to protect his secrets? She found more items in the box. A deputy's badge, not James's, but someone else's. The name engraved on the back was Samuel Gray, one of the miners who had died in the collapse. A list of names, handwritten by James. 7 names she assumed were the dead miners, but 2 names had question marks next to them, and at the bottom, circled several times, Silos Brennan, alive. She had no idea who Silos Brennan was, but the fact that James had circled the name with such emphasis suggested he was important. There was one more item at the bottom of the box, a folded piece of paper that felt different from the newspaper clippings. Heavier, more official. She unfolded it carefully. It was a topographical map, professionally drawn, showing a section of the mountains west of Ridgewood. 3 locations were marked with X's in red ink. Next to each X, a number, 1, 2, 3. And at the bottom of the map, in James's handwriting, evidence buried, safe. Eveline stared at the map, her mind racing. James had buried evidence. 3 separate caches in the mountains, an insurance policy against Kettering's power and reach. If something happened to him, someone could retrieve that evidence and finally bring Kettering to justice. But who was that someone? Tobias? Or had James always intended it to be her? She found a note tucked behind the map, unaddressed. If you're reading this, I've failed. I couldn't stop him, couldn't protect everyone I should have. But you can finish what I started. The evidence is buried in these 3 locations. Everything you need to prove what Kettering did. The embezzlement, the murders, all of it. Take it to the federals in Denver. Don't trust the local law. Half of them are on Kettering's payroll. Don't trust Cross. He examined the bodies from the mine and ruled them accidental deaths when any competent doctor would have seen the signs of violence. He's been bought. Vernon Cross. The name hit her like a punch. The doctor who had examined James's body, who had signed the death certificate, who had looked her in the eye and told her it was a tragic accident. James had known Cross was corrupt. He had known and said nothing, because speaking up would have put her in danger. The note continued. I'm sorry I hid this from you, Eve. I'm sorry for everything. I thought I was protecting you by leaving you in ignorance. Maybe I was just being a coward. Maybe I should have trusted you with the truth from the start. If I could do it all over again. The sentence ended there, unfinished, as if James had been interrupted or had second thoughts about what he wanted to say. Eveline folded the note carefully and placed it back in the box with the map. Her hands were steady now, her mind clear. The initial shock had receded, leaving something harder and sharper behind. James was alive. He had faked his death to escape Kettering's reach. He had let Eveline grieve while he hid in the mountains, gathering evidence, building his case, and Vernon Cross had helped him do it. The realization should have brought relief. Her husband wasn't dead, but instead, it brought a complicated tangle of emotions she couldn't unravel. Anger at the lie, grief for the 10 years they had lost, fear of what Kettering might do if he discovered James was alive, and beneath it all, a stubborn, fierce love that hadn't died through it all. She stood at the window, watching the sun set over the western peaks. James had been here. He could be nearby now, watching the cabin, wondering who had arrived. Or he could be miles away, checking on one of his evidence caches, unaware that she had finally found what he'd left behind. Either way, she wasn't leaving. She would stay in this cabin, sleep in his bed, eat his food, and wait. He would come back eventually. He had to. This was his refuge, his base of operations, and when he walked through that door, she would have questions. So many questions. Night fell quickly in the mountains. Eveline lit the lamp, built up the fire in the hearth, and made a simple meal from the supplies on the shelves. She ate methodically, tasting nothing, her mind consumed with everything she had learned. After eating, she sat at the table and reread the journal entries, this time searching for patterns, for clues to James's current whereabouts. He mentioned regularly checking the southern game trail for Kettering's men. He wrote about seeing the same mountain lion several times, tracking its movements through the territory. He noted the seasonal patterns of deer and elk, the best places to hunt, the water sources that remained reliable even in times of drought. He was living like a ghost, she realized, moving through the mountains with the kind of knowledge that came from years of careful observation, avoiding human contact, surviving on skill and caution. How lonely he must have been, how isolated. She tried to feel sympathy for his plight, but all she could find was anger. He had chosen this. He had chosen to leave her, to let her mourn, to spend 10 years in self-imposed exile rather than trust her with the truth. Around midnight, she heard the soft crunch of boots on the gravel outside. Eveline's hand reached for the shotgun propped against the wall beside her chair. She lifted it in silence, checked that it was loaded, and moved to the side of the door where she wouldn't be seen from outside. The footsteps approached slowly, deliberately. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide their presence. The steps reached the porch, paused, and then a voice, rough with exhaustion and something that might have been relief, spoke. Eveline, I knew you'd come eventually. It wasn't James. Evelyn kept the shotgun raised, her finger resting beside the trigger guard. Show yourself, slowly, and keep your hands where I can see them. The door creaked open, and a man stepped into the lamplight. He was in his 60s, lean, with a weather-beaten face, gray hair, and a beard that needed a trim. His hands were raised to shoulder height, empty. His eyes, a pale and tired blue, fixed on her with an expression that was as much weariness as it was relief. "Tobias Quinn," he said. "I rode with James back when he was sheriff. Been looking after this cabin for him, waiting for the day you'd arrive." Evelyn didn't lower the shotgun. Tobias moved slowly, dipping 2 fingers into his coat pocket. He pulled out a worn leather wallet and tossed it gently onto the table. "My old badge is in there. Photo of me and James from when we worked together." She picked up the wallet with one hand and flipped it open. The deputy's badge was tarnished, but genuine. The photograph showed 2 young men in uniform, side by side. One was unmistakably James at 25, brimming with confidence and resolve. The other was Tobias, decades younger, but recognizable. Evelyn set the wallet down but kept the shotgun aimed. "How do I know you're with him? How do I know you don't work for Kettering?" "You don't," Tobias said simply. "But if I worked for Kettering, you'd already be dead. I've been watching the trail since noon. Saw you ride in. I could have shot you at any time. Instead, I waited for dark and walked through the front door. That's not how you kill someone. That's how you introduce yourself to someone you're trying to help." It was a good point. Evelyn lowered the shotgun slightly, but didn't put it down. "Is James alive?" "Yes. You helped him fake his death." "I did. Where is he?" Tobias shook his head slowly. "I don't know. That's the God's honest truth. I can see you don't believe me, but it's the truth all the same. James and I had a deal. I'd watch the cabin, keep an eye out, make sure no one found this place. He'd get in touch every few months, leave messages, let me know he was all right. 3 months ago, the messages stopped." A knot of ice formed in Evelyn's chest. "What do you mean, stopped?" "I mean he's vanished again. Only this time, I don't think it was by choice." Tobias gestured to one of the chairs. "Mind if I sit? I've spent most of the day in the saddle, and my back isn't what it used to be." Evelyn nodded. Tobias sank into the chair with a grunt of relief. She remained standing, the shotgun still in her hand, but now pointed at the floor instead of at him. "Tell me everything," she said. "Start at the beginning." Tobias rubbed his face with both hands, then leaned back in the chair. "The beginning would be the Silver Ridge mine. You know about that?" "I know James investigated it. I know 7 men died. I know he found proof of murder and embezzlement. And I know Kettering threatened him to keep him quiet." "Then you know more than I thought. James always said you were sharp, said you'd figure it out if you had enough pieces of the puzzle. He gave me nothing but secrets and lies." "He gave you safety," Tobias corrected gently. "Kettering's reach is long, and his memory is longer. Everyone who ever crossed him ended up dead or disappeared. James put himself on that list to keep you off it. Faking his death. It turned the tables." Tobias leaned forward, elbows on his knees. 10 years ago, Cyrus Wade came to town. He's Kettering's right-hand man, the one who does the dirty work, if you take my meaning. Wade was the one who made sure those 7 miners didn't survive the cave-in. He's the one who killed Marshall Garrett 2 years back, when Garrett got too close to the truth. And 10 years ago, he came for James. Evelyn sank into the other chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. "What happened?" "James knew he was coming. He'd been expecting it for weeks, ever since he'd spotted Wade watching the house. So he set a trap. He told me he was heading up into the mountains to check on the cabin. Asked me to follow a day later, bring up supplies. What he didn't tell me was that he expected Wade to follow him. Tobias's voice grew quiet. Wade ambushed James on a narrow trail, high above Copper Creek. Probably figured he'd shoot him, push the body over the edge, make it look like a fall. But James was ready. He hid in the rocks, waited for Wade to pass, then came at him from behind. And James, he was one of the best fighters I ever knew. Had army training before he became a deputy. He got the upper hand, disarmed Wade, and in the struggle Wade went over the cliff. Fell maybe 30 feet onto the rocks below. Broke his neck. Eveline held her breath. James killed him? It was self-defense, but it gave him an idea. Tobias's expression was grim. Wade was about the same height and build as James. His face was badly damaged from the fall. James made a choice right then and there. He'd bring Wade's body down the mountain, claim it was his, and disappear. Vernon Cross. Dr. Cross examined the body. Cross was already on Kettering's payroll, Eveline pieced together. For years. James knew it. Knew Cross would falsify a death certificate for the right price. So James made the offer. Enough gold to set Cross up comfortably in exchange for identifying Wade's body as James Drayton, killed in a tragic fall. And Cross agreed. I helped James stage the scene. Then I brought Wade's body into town, while James vanished up here. We told everyone James had been checking trap lines in the mountains and had fallen. That we found him too late. Cross did his part, signed the certificate. You buried Cyrus Wade 10 years ago, Eveline. James has been alive, in hiding ever since. The lamp flickered, casting shifting shadows across Tobias's aged face. Eveline sat in silence, trying to process it all. Her husband had killed a man in self-defense and then used the body to fake his own death. He had bribed a corrupt doctor. He had orchestrated an elaborate deception that had fooled an entire town for a decade. And he had done it all without telling her. The pocket watch, she said suddenly. James's father's watch. I saw them bury it with him. Tobias reached into his waistcoat and produced the watch in question. It gleamed softly in the lamplight, its engraved case reflecting the flame. James gave it to me the night before we brought Wade's body down. He told me to keep it safe. Bring it up here to the cabin. Leave it where you'd eventually find it. He placed it on the table between them. He said you'd recognize it. Said it would prove he'd planned all this. That none of it was accident or impulse. He wanted you to know he was thinking of you, even in the middle of everything else. Eveline picked up the watch, feeling the familiar weight in her palm. She had given it to James on their 5th anniversary, having inherited it from his father after the old man passed. James had cherished it, wound it every morning, kept it running perfectly. She opened the case. Inside the lid, the inscription she'd had carved for him read, "With all my love." Beneath it, in a newer, rougher hand, were more words. Sorry, I'll fix this. I promise. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. Eveline snapped the watch case shut and placed it back on the table. She looked at Tobias, her eyes dry despite the storm behind them. You said James stopped sending messages 3 months ago. Tell me about that. Tobias nodded, seeming to understand her need to focus on action over emotion. James and I had a system. Every couple of months he'd leave a note in a dead drop, about 5 miles south of here, in an old, lightning-struck hollow tree. The note would say he was okay, what supplies he needed, any concerns he had. I'd bring what he asked for, leave it in the cabin, and he'd pick it up when it was safe. But 3 months ago, I went to the drop and found a message that chilled me to the bone. Tobias's expression darkened. James wrote that he'd found something big, evidence that would finally bring Kettering down. He'd gotten his hands on Kettering's private ledger, the one that documented everything. Not just the mine collapse, but years of criminal activity. Money laundering, bribery, more deaths than just the 7 miners. James said it was enough to put Kettering in prison for life, maybe even get him hanged. That should have been good news. It should have been. But the message also said that Kettering knew. Somehow, Kettering found out James was alive, and he'd sent men to hunt him. James said he was going deep into hiding, that he wouldn't be checking the drop for a while. He told me to watch the cabin, and if you ever showed up, Tobias met her eyes. He said if you ever showed up, I was to tell you everything. Give you the watch, show you the evidence caches he set up, and help you finish what he started. Because he thought he might not survive. Because he knew he might not. Kettering doesn't forgive, and he doesn't forget. If he knew James was alive and had proof against him, he'd use every resource he had to find James and make sure that proof never saw the light of day. Eveline rose and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. The moon had risen, casting a silver light over the mountain peaks. Somewhere out there, James was either in hiding or he was already dead, and she was chasing a ghost all over again. Show me the evidence caches, she said, not turning around. Show me on the map. Tobias took the surveyor's map from the wooden box and spread it across the table. 3 locations. James chose them carefully. Places hard to find unless you know exactly where to look, but accessible if you have the map. He pointed to the first X. This is the closest. Maybe a day's ride from here. It's a cave system near Widow's Gap, where the narrow pass cuts through the ridge. James buried a waterproof container there with documents, copies of his original notes from the mine collapse investigation. His finger moved to the second X. This one's trickier. It's in the ruins of the old mission, about 2 days southeast. Spanish missionaries built a church there 100 years ago, abandoned it when the local tribes ran them off. James hid the evidence in the mission's foundation, under what used to be the altar. And the third? Tobias's finger hovered over the third X, located on the far western edge of the map. That's the most dangerous. It's deep in Kettering's territory, not far from the Silver Ridge mine itself. James said if we needed the original ledger, the one with Kettering's own handwriting and seal, that's where it would be. He managed to steal it from Kettering's private safe 3 months ago, just before Kettering realized he was alive. Eveline studied the map, memorizing the locations. We need to retrieve all of it. Get it to the federal marshals in Denver. Present the evidence. Force them to act. Assuming the marshals in Denver aren't on Kettering's payroll too. Some of them have to be honest. The system can't be that corrupt, can it? Tobias's voice was gentle, but firm. Kettering's been building his network for 15 years. He's got judges, sheriffs, politicians, businessmen, all either working for him or looking the other way. The only reason James thought he had a chance was because he'd made contact with one federal marshal he trusted. Someone from outside the territory who wasn't caught in Kettering's web. Eveline turned from the window. Who? U.S. Marshal Elizabeth Grady. She's based in Denver but travels the circuit. James met her 2 years ago when she was investigating some cattle rustling near the Colorado-Wyoming border. He sounded her out carefully, told her a little about his situation, and she agreed to help if he could bring her concrete proof. They've been communicating in code through newspaper personals ever since. Does she know James is alive? Yes. James sent her a wire 3 months ago, telling her he had the proof and that he'd meet her in Denver within the week. He never showed up. The implication hung in the cabin like a heavy shroud. If James had the ledger and was trying to get it to Marshal Grady, and if Kettering knew James was alive, then the most likely scenario was that Kettering's men had intercepted him somewhere between here and Denver. "We have to find him," Eveline said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "Before we worry about proof or marshals, we need to find James," Tobias said, his voice worn thin. "I've been searching for 3 months. I've checked every place I thought he could have gone. Followed every breadcrumb he ever mentioned in his letters. Either he's a master at hiding or—" Tobias let the sentence hang in the air. He didn't need to finish it. Eveline picked up the journal from where she'd left it on the table. She thumbed through the pages, her eyes scanning the familiar script, searching for patterns, for habits, anything that might reveal how James would behave in a crisis. One entry, dated 6 months ago, snagged her attention. "Checked the eagle's nest at the overlook today. The same pair has been nesting there for years, raising their young in the very spot we used to watch them from. Evie would love to see how the place has remained unchanged. It's become a kind of anchor for me. Whenever I feel lost or unsure of what I'm doing, I go there. It reminds me why I'm fighting. For the life we were supposed to have. For the future I stole from us both." The overlook. The place he'd proposed, where they had spent that long golden afternoon watching the eagles soar. The memory had struck her just yesterday as she rode up the mountain, catching her off guard with its piercing clarity. "Where we watched the eagles," she murmured, reading the passage again. "Where you—" Tobias looked over at her, his expression sharp. "What is it?" She showed him the entry, then reached for the note James had left with the map. His final message had said, "Where we watched the eagles, where you said yes." "I thought it was just sentiment," she said, her voice trembling with dawning realization. "But maybe it was a clue. Maybe he's hiding near the overlook, the one place that meant everything to us." Tobias leaned closer, reading the words for himself. "That's a 3-day ride from here at least. Rough country most of the way. If James went there injured, or with men on his trail, he'd need help. He'd need someone to come for him." Eveline folded the map with deliberate care and tucked it inside her coat. "You said he asked you to help me finish what he started. This is how we do it. We find James. We get that ledger. We take everything to Marshal Grady, and we end this." "It's not that simple," Tobias cautioned. "Kettering's men could be watching the overlook. They might have already found him. Walking into that could get us killed." "Then we'll be careful. We'll be smart. No unnecessary risks." Eveline met his gaze, her own unwavering. "But I am going to that overlook, Tobias. I'm going to find my husband. You can come with me or you can stay here, but I'm leaving at first light either way." Tobias was silent for a long moment, studying her face. Then he gave a slow, reluctant nod. "James said you were stubborn. Said it was one of the things he loved most about you, even when it drove him mad." "He should have told me the truth." "Yes," Tobias agreed simply. "He should have. But he was trying to protect you the only way he knew how. It was wrong, and it cost you both years you can never get back. But it came from love, Eveline, not cruelty." She wanted to argue, to cling to the sharp, clean edges of her anger, because it was so much easier than the tangled knot of grief and hope beneath it. But she was too tired, and the truth was more complicated than simple rage allowed. "We leave at dawn," she said instead. "Get some rest. We have a long ride ahead." Tobias nodded and moved toward the loft ladder. "There are blankets up there. I'll take the loft. Leave the bed for you." After he'd climbed up and settled in for the night, Evelyn extinguished the lamp and sat in the darkness, the pocket watch clutched in her hand. She wound it carefully, listening to the familiar, rhythmic ticking of the mechanism, a sound she had heard 1,000 times over the years they'd been together. The inscription gleamed faintly in the moonlight slanting through the window. "Sorry, I'll fix this. I promise." "You'd better be alive," she whispered into the shadows. "Because if you're dead, I swear I'll kill you myself for putting me through this." Somewhere in the night, an owl hooted. The wind sighed through the pines, and Evelyn sat in James's secret cabin, holding his father's watch, bracing herself for whatever tomorrow would bring. They set out at daybreak, following a trail Tobias knew well. The morning was cool and crisp, the kind of early summer day where the air tasted clean and the sky stretched out, an endless, aching blue above the mountain peaks. Under any other circumstances, Evelyn might have savored the beauty of it. Instead, she rode with her jaw set, her eyes scanning the path ahead, every sense on high alert. Tobias rode in front, setting a steady pace that wouldn't tire the horses. He was a capable rider, moving with an ease that came from decades in the saddle. They didn't talk much. There was little to say after the previous night's revelations, and the silence that settled between them was companionable rather than strained. By mid-morning they stopped to rest the horses and refill their canteens at a spring bubbling up between moss-covered rocks. As Tobias rummaged in his saddlebag for some dried meat, a photograph slipped from his coat pocket and fluttered to the ground. Evelyn picked it up automatically, and then she froze. It was a picture of a man standing in front of the cabin, James's cabin. But this wasn't a photo from 10 years ago. The man was older than the James she remembered, with more gray in his hair and beard, the lines around his eyes etched deeper by time. He was smiling faintly, one hand raised in a casual wave. And standing beside him, her hand resting on his arm, was a woman Evelyn had never seen before. The woman was perhaps in her 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and a capable air about her. She wore men's trousers and a sturdy coat, clearly dressed for the rugged terrain. She wasn't beautiful in a conventional sense, but there was something striking about her, an intelligence in her eyes, a strength in the set of her shoulders. Evelyn turned the photograph over. On the back, a handwritten date she didn't recognize. March 1875. 3 months ago. She looked up at Tobias, who had gone utterly still. He had the guilty look of a man who knew he'd just made a terrible mistake. "Who is this woman?" Evelyn's voice was quiet, almost detached, but her hand trembled as she held the photo. Tobias closed his eyes for a brief second. "That's Marshall Grady, Elizabeth Grady. The picture was taken the last time James met with her, when he was showing her the cabin as a potential safe house. You told me James was in hiding, alone, for 10 years. He was, for the most part. Marshall Grady is the only person, besides me, who knew he was alive. She needed to see the cabin, to understand his situation, to know where to find him if communications broke down. So he brought her here, and I took that picture to document the meeting." It was a reasonable explanation. Evelyn wanted to believe it. But something about the image, the casual way the woman's hand rested on James's arm, the easy intimacy of the pose, the faint smile on his face sent a cold spike of doubt through her. "She's more than just his contact, isn't she?" Evelyn said, her tone flat. "Tell me the truth, Tobias. All of it." Tobias met her gaze, and in his expression she saw pity, guilt, and a terrible reluctance. "You have to understand, Evelyn. James thought he'd lost you forever. He'd given up any hope of a normal life. He was living alone in these mountains, haunted by what he'd done, knowing he could never go back. And then he met Marshall Grady. She understood what he was going through because she'd lost people too, sacrificed relationships for her work. They became friends, close friends. Friends. The word came out sharp and bitter. "Yes, just friends," Tobias insisted. "James loved you, Evelyn. He never stopped loving you. Every time we spoke, he'd talk about you, ask how you were, if you were safe, if you'd found any happiness in spite of what he'd done. Marshall Grady knew all about you. She knew he was still a married man in every way that mattered to him." Evelyn stared down at the photograph, at the woman whose hand rested so naturally on her husband's arm. "Did he love her?" "I don't know," Tobias said, and his honesty was a cruel sort of kindness. "Maybe a little. Or maybe he just cherished having someone who understood, someone he didn't have to hide from. But if you're asking if he betrayed you, if he forgot his vows to you, the answer is no. James may have failed you in many ways, Evelyn, but not in that one." Carefully, Evelyn tucked the photograph into her own pocket instead of handing it back. She needed time to process this, to sort through the chaotic surge of emotions it had stirred. Jealousy felt absurd. How could she be jealous when she'd believed James was dead? And yet, there it was, a sharp and undeniable pain. "Let's keep moving," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Whatever was between James and Marshall Grady doesn't change what we have to do." They rode in silence for the next few hours, the trail climbing steadily through pine forests and across bare rock faces that offered stunning views of the valleys below. Her mind turned over everything she had learned, trying to fit this new, jagged piece into the puzzle of her life. James had been alone for a decade, believing he could never return to her. In that isolation, he had formed a bond with someone else, someone who understood his burden. It didn't erase his love for her, but it complicated it, adding layers she had never expected to confront. And her own feelings? She had spent 10 years grieving, slowly, painstakingly building a life that did not include him. Now he was alive and she was riding to find him. But what happened after that? Could they simply pick up their marriage as if nothing had changed? Could she ever forgive him for the years he had stolen? And could he forgive her? For what? She had done nothing wrong. She was the one who was abandoned, deceived. Yet a whisper of guilt slithered in. She had seen him pulling away in those final months and had said nothing. She had let him carry his burdens alone because it was easier than pressing for a truth she was afraid to hear. Maybe if she had been more persistent, they could have faced his demons together. The trail broke from the forest onto a high, windswept ridge. Tobias reined in his horse and pointed ahead. "The overlook is about 2 hours from here. We should approach on foot. If James is there and doesn't know we're coming, he might mistake us for Kettering's men. And if Kettering's men are already there, we turn back, regroup, and find another way." I won't lead you into an ambush, Evelyn. James would never forgive me. They continued along the ridge, moving slower now, both of them scanning for any sign of recent passage. The trail here was little more than a game path, barely wide enough for the horses. To their left, the mountain dropped away into a sheer cliff. To their right, jagged rocks climbed toward the peaks above. They dismounted a half-mile out, tethering the horses in a thicket of pines before continuing on foot. As they drew closer, the sound of a single, sharp rifle shot echoed through the high-altitude silence. They froze, exchanging a stark look before scrambling for the cover of a rocky outcropping. From there, they could see the overlook, and they could see the trouble. James was pinned down behind a cluster of boulders near the edge of the cliff. Above him, on a higher ridge, two men were positioned, their rifles trained on his location. Before either of them could speak, a new voice, low and steady, came from behind them. They've had him trapped since yesterday. Evelyn and Tobias spun around. It was the woman from the photograph, Marshal Elizabeth Grady. She wasn't alone. Two other figures emerged from the rocks, rifles held at the ready. Grady gave them a curt nod, her eyes assessing them with a professional calm that was both unnerving and reassuring. I'm glad you're here. We're going to need the extra guns. She spread a rough sketch of the overlook on a flat rock, marking positions with small stones. The two men we can see are here and here, she said, tapping the ridge above James's position. They have clear lines of fire on anyone approaching from the south or east, but there's a blind spot. She indicated a section of the cliff face. If we come in from the north, using this rock formation as cover, we can get within 50 yards before they see us. Tobias asked, so we create a crossfire? Exactly. I'll take the high ground here. She marked another spot on the sketch. I can cover both snipers. Gwen, she looked to one of her companions. You circle around from the west and come in low. Mrs. Drayton, her gaze fell on Evelyn. You'll provide suppressing fire from this position. When I give the signal, we all move at once. The confusion should give James time to take cover and arm himself properly. Evelyn studied the map. What's to stop them from just shooting James the second they realize they're being attacked? Nothing, Marshal Grady said bluntly. Which is why timing is critical. We need to take out at least one of them in the first volley. Put the other on the defensive. If we can draw their fire from James to us, we have a chance, and if there are more than two, we adjust. A fight is fluid. You plan as best you can and you adapt when the plan falls apart. Marshal Grady looked at each of them in turn, her expression grim. This is dangerous. I won't lie to you. We're outnumbered and they have the superior position. If any of you want to back out, now is the time. Tobias checked his rifle, his jaw tight. James is my friend. I'm not backing out. Evelyn met Marshal Grady's gaze directly. He's my husband. I'm not leaving him to die. Something passed between the two women then. An acknowledgement of their shared purpose. A silent understanding of the complicated ground on which they stood. Marshal Grady gave a single, sharp nod. All right then. Let's run through it one more time. Marshal Grady was a study in methodical professionalism, the kind of person who left nothing to chance. She made sure everyone knew their role, what signals to watch for, and what to do if something went wrong. As they prepared, Evelyn found herself observing the marshal more closely. Elizabeth Grady was perhaps 45, with a face weathered by years spent outdoors. Her hands were calloused, capable, She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of either military training or a long career in law enforcement. There was nothing soft about her, but nothing cruel either. She struck Evelyn as someone who had sacrificed personal comfort and conventional happiness for a greater purpose. Did James love this woman? The question tormented Evelyn, despite her attempts to focus on the immediate crisis. And perhaps more troubling, did it even matter? Did James believe Evelyn was lost to him forever? Could she truly blame him for finding some companionship, some understanding in his exile? "You're thinking about James and me, aren't you?" Marshall Grady said quietly, pulling Evelyn from her thoughts. Tobias had moved off to check his horse, leaving the two women alone for a moment. Evelyn considered denying it, but decided honesty was simpler. "I was. Are you?" "Friends, that's all." "I saw the photograph," Evelyn said. "I know how it must have looked." Marshall Grady's voice was matter-of-fact, neither defensive nor apologetic. "James told me about you from the first day we met. About your marriage, about what he'd sacrificed, about the guilt that ate at him every single day. He never let me forget he was still married to you in every way that mattered." "But you cared for him anyway." "Yes," Marshall Grady admitted. "I cared. I still do, not romantically. Or maybe a little, I won't lie. But mostly I respect him. What he's trying to do, the stand he's taking against Kettering, despite everything it's cost him. There aren't many men with that kind of integrity." Evelyn was silent for a moment. "He spoke of me?" "Oh, constantly. Your favorite foods, the way you'd hum while you worked. How you could outshoot most men he knew. The sound of your laugh." Marshall Grady's expression softened slightly. "He loved you, Mrs. Drayton. He never stopped. Whatever happens today, you need to know that." Before Evelyn could reply, Tobias returned. "The sun's getting low. If we're going to do this, we should move. Better now than waiting for dusk, when everyone's visibility is compromised." Marshall Grady nodded and rose, dusting off her trousers. "Everyone clear on the plan?" They confirmed they were. Marshall Grady glanced at a pocket watch. "We move in 10 minutes. Use the time to get your heads right. Remember, when the shooting starts, it's all going to happen fast. Do not hesitate. Hesitation gets people killed." Evelyn checked her rifle one last time, made sure she had extra ammunition easily accessible, and tried to calm her racing heart. She'd been a hunter her whole life. She was comfortable with firearms, but she had never aimed one at another human being. The thought of it made her stomach churn. "You'll do fine," Tobias murmured, reading her expression. "When the time comes, you'll do what needs to be done. You always have." "How would you know?" "James spoke of you a great deal. You're stronger than you think, Evelyn." The 10 minutes passed far too quickly. Marshall Grady gave the signal, and they split up, each moving to their designated position across the rugged mountainside. Evelyn found her spot behind an outcropping of boulders that offered good cover and a clear line of sight to the ridge where Kettering's men were waiting. From there, she could see James's shelter below and the two snipers above. The distance was perhaps 150 yards. A challenging shot, but not an impossible one. She settled in, resting the rifle barrel in a smooth depression in the rock. Through the rifle's scope, she could clearly see one of the snipers, a man in his 30s with a dark beard, wearing a brown duster. He was watching James's shelter with the patient focus of a predator. The minutes crawled by as she waited for Marshall Grady's signal, a flash of sunlight off her hand mirror. The waiting was torture. Every second stretched longer than the last. Then she saw it. 3 quick flashes from the rocks to the north. Go. Eveline centered the crosshairs on the bearded man, her finger taking up the slack on the trigger. Everything Tobias and the marshal had said about not hesitating echoed in her mind. This man was here to kill James. If she didn't stop him, her husband would die. She fired. The rifle's report cracked through the rocks like thunder. The bearded man convulsed and pitched backward, disappearing from view. Eveline didn't wait to see if she had killed him. She was already working the bolt, chambering another round, searching for the second sniper. He reacted fast, ducking for cover and bringing his own rifle around to find a target. His return shot whined past the rock inches from Eveline's head, spraying her with stone shrapnel. She pressed herself lower, her heart hammering against her ribs. From the north, Marshal Grady's rifle fired twice in quick succession. The second sniper's hat flew from his head, and he scrambled for better cover. Tobias's rifle joined in from the west, bullets kicking up dust and rock around the sniper's position. Below, James had burst from his shelter at the first shot. Despite a wounded arm and leg, he moved with surprising speed, diving behind a boulder and pulling a revolver from his belt. He fired twice up at the ridge, adding his own firepower to the barrage. The second sniper returned fire wildly, clearly rattled at being suddenly attacked from 3 directions. His shots were high, panicked bursts rather than aimed shots. Then Eveline saw movement from a third position she hadn't noticed before. Another man, this one positioned lower on the ridge, with a direct line of fire to James's new cover. "James!" she screamed, but her voice was lost in the gunfire. The third man raised his rifle, taking careful aim at James's position. Eveline swung her rifle around, knowing she didn't have time for a careful shot. She fired twice, quickly, both rounds smacking into the rocks near the third gunman. It wasn't precise, but it was enough. He flinched back from the incoming fire, his own shot going wide. James must have seen him in that moment, because he rolled out from behind the rock, rose to one knee despite his injured leg, and fired 3 deliberate shots. The third gunman dropped his rifle and collapsed. The second sniper, the one Marshal Grady and Tobias had been battling, broke from cover and ran for it. He made it maybe 20 feet before Marshal Grady's rifle barked one more time. He fell and did not move. Then silence fell over the overlook, broken only by the ringing in Eveline's ears and the cry of the hawk still circling high above. "Clear!" yelled Marshal Grady. "All clear!" Tobias echoed. Eveline got to her feet, her legs trembling. She kept her rifle raised, scanning for more threats, but the ridge was empty now, save for the fallen men. Below, James was pushing himself up, using the boulder for support. He was looking around, trying to see who had come to his aid. His eyes found Tobias first, and Eveline saw a flash of relief on his face. Then he saw her. She watched him freeze, saw his expression cycle through disbelief, shock, and something that might have been joy or terror, or both. He took a staggering step forward, then stopped, as if he didn't trust his own eyes. Eveline started down the slope toward him, her legs carrying her forward, before her mind had fully decided what she would say, what she would do when she reached him. 10 years. 10 years of grief and loneliness, and believing he was dead. 10 years of lies and secrets and choices made without her. She closed the distance between them, vaguely aware of Tobias and Marshal Grady approaching as well, checking on the downed snipers. James just stood there waiting, his face a mask of emotions too complex to read. He was thinner than she remembered, older, worn by hardship. But his eyes, those were still the same eyes that had looked at her from across a barn dance floor 23 years ago. "Eve," he said, his voice raw and broken. "You're here. You're really here." She had planned to be angry, to demand explanations, to rage at him for what he had done to her. Instead, she walked straight up to him and slapped him, hard enough to snap his head to the side. Then, she grabbed the front of his shirt with both fists and kissed him. The kiss lasted only a moment before Eveline pulled back, her hands still clenching his shirt. She could feel him trembling, or maybe it was her. Up close, she could see the toll the years had taken. Deep lines around his eyes, gray in his beard, a leanness that spoke of too many missed meals and sleepless nights. "You're alive," she said, her voice shaking. "You son of a bitch!" "Eve," he breathed, seeming unable to find any other words. His good hand came up to touch her face, hesitant, as if he expected her to vanish. "God, I'm so sorry. I am so sorry." She wanted to hit him again. She wanted to hold him. She wanted to scream and cry and demand answers. Instead, she forced herself to take a step back, to create distance because if she stayed close, she would either lash out or collapse into his arms, and neither would help anyone right now. "We need to move," Marshal Grady said, approaching with her rifle still at the ready, her eyes scanning the surrounding terrain. "Those shots will echo in these mountains. If Kettering has more men in the area, they'll have heard." Tobias was checking the bodies of the dead snipers. "All three are down. One of them's got a telegraph form. Looks like they were planning to send word to Kettering once they had a pin on James's location." "Did they send it?" Marshal Grady asked sharply. "No. Still in his pocket." "Good. That buys us some time, but not much." She looked at James. "Can you ride?" James nodded, though the grimace on his face suggested it would be agony. "I can manage. The leg's bad, but it's not broken. Just a graze that got infected. Been tending it as best I could." "And your arm?" "Dislocated the shoulder in a fall 3 weeks ago. Got it back in myself, but it's still weak." Marshal Grady's expression was all business. "You need a doctor, but that will have to wait. Right now, we need to get off this mountain and somewhere safe." She turned to Eveline. "Mrs. Drayton, that was a hell of a shot. You likely saved James's life, spotting that third man." Eveline just nodded, unable to speak. She was still trying to process it all. Her emotions were a tangled mess. She had found James, alive. She had killed a man, maybe more than one. The world had turned upside down, and she no longer knew which way was up. "Horses are this way," Tobias said. "We need to go, now." They helped James to his feet. He tried to walk on his own, but his leg buckled after 2 steps. Tobias was instantly at his side, taking his weight on his good side. They moved slowly back toward where the horses were tied. James's eyes kept finding Eveline's, searching her face as if trying to read her thoughts. "Did you find the letters?" he asked quietly. "I found everything," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "The letters, the journal, the caches of evidence you mapped out. I found your secret life and your secret plans that never once included telling me the truth. Eve, I was protecting you. You were running," she said, the words coming out harsher than she'd intended. "You ran from Kettering. You ran from your responsibilities. And you ran from me. You let me believe you were dead rather than trust me to be strong enough to handle the truth." James flinched as if she had struck him again. You're right. About all of it. I was a coward. I took the easier path, instead of facing what I'd done, what I'd put us in. There's nothing easy about faking your own death and living in the mountains for 10 years. It was easier, he said, his voice breaking. Easier than looking you in the eye and admitting I had failed. Failed to protect you. That those men were coming for us because of my investigation, because I couldn't let an injustice stand. His voice cracked. 7 men died in that mine, Eve. Men with families, with children. I had proof that could bring their killer to justice, and I destroyed it because I was afraid. I've been living with that cowardice for 15 years. They reached the horses. Evelyn's steed, Ebenezer, stamped nervously, sensing the tension. Marshal Grady's horse was calm, well-trained, a reflection of its owner. James's horse, a lean, dapple-gray stallion, stood tethered nearby, its saddle cinched and ready. We can argue later, Marshal Grady said, her voice cutting through the tension. Right now, we need to put distance between us and this place. She looked at James. The ledger? You still have it? James inclined his head toward his stallion. In my saddlebag. It's the only copy in existence with Kettering's own signature and seal. All the others were just reconstructions, pieced together from memory and second-hand papers. Marshal Grady checked the saddlebag herself, a look of profound relief washing over her face as she found a leather-bound book wrapped in oilcloth. She held it up for a moment, the weight of their mission contained within its pages, before carefully rewrapping it. This is what we need to bring Kettering down, she declared. Original records, in his own hand, documenting 15 years of embezzlement, bribery, and murder. Will it be enough? Eveline asked. Combined with James's testimony and the supporting documents he's provided, yes. It'll be enough to see him hang, if we can get it to Denver and present it to the territorial judge. That's a big if, Tobias muttered, his hand instinctively going to the stock of his rifle. Kettering controls half the law between here and Denver. The moment he realizes we have this book, he'll throw everything he has at stopping us. Marshal Grady was already swinging into her saddle. Then we don't give him time to react. We ride hard. We ride fast. And we don't stop until we reach federal protection. I have deputies I can trust in Denver. Once we're there, Kettering's reach won't matter. James struggled to mount his horse, his injured arm making the simple act an agony. Before she'd even consciously decided to, Eveline was there, steadying him, giving him the push he needed to get into the saddle and adjusting his stirrups. He looked down at her, his expression filled with 1,000 things he couldn't say. Thank you, was all he managed. She didn't reply, simply turned and mounted Patience. Whatever needed to be said between them would have to wait. Survival came first. They set off at a demanding pace, following a game trail that wound east and south toward the lower altitudes. Marshal Grady took the lead, her expertise with the territory evident in her every choice of path. Tobias rode close to James, ready to steady him should his injuries cause him to sway. Eveline brought up the rear, her eyes constantly scanning their back trail for any sign of pursuit. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and violent red. Beautiful, Eveline thought, and as distant as blood on snow. Everything looks peaceful, but underneath, violence is just waiting to erupt. They had been riding for perhaps half an hour when Marshal Grady suddenly reined in her horse, her hand shooting up in a signal to halt. Ahead, dark figures against the fading light. Riders, at least 5 of them, making their way up the trail toward them. Kettering's men? Tobias asked, his voice low, his hand already on his rifle. Marshal Grady raised a small spyglass, studying the approaching horsemen. After a long moment, she lowered it, her expression grim. Can't tell at this distance. Could be innocent travelers. Could be more of Kettering's men responding to the gunshots. We can't afford to assume they're friendly, James said, his voice strained with pain, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. There's a narrow defile about a quarter-mile back. We can hole up there. Let them pass if they're innocent. Ambush them if they're not. Or we could make a run for it, Eveline suggested. Our horses are fresh. If we push them, we might be able to outrun. And ride straight into whatever trap they've set up the trail? The marshal countered. No, James is right. We find cover, assess the threat, and act accordingly. They turned their horses and rode quickly back to the defile James had mentioned. A tight slash in the rock, barely wide enough for a horse and rider. It would funnel anyone who followed them into a killing ground. They dismounted, took positions among the rocks with their weapons drawn, and waited. The approaching riders appeared 5 minutes later, moving at a steady, purposeful pace that spoke of a mission, not a casual journey. Eveline counted 6 of them, all armed, all wearing the kind of hard-worn range clothes that marked them as hired guns. They moved with the easy coordination of a group that had ridden together before. Marshal Grady watched them through her spyglass, her jaw tight. The one in the lead, the big man with the red kerchief, that's Cole Mitchell. He's one of Kettering's top enforcers. If he's here, it's no coincidence. They must have already been in the area, Tobias said quietly, waiting for orders once the scouts located James. James shifted his position slightly, wincing at the movement, but gaining a better angle with his revolver. Mitchell's dangerous, fast and cruel. The others will be seasoned too. Kettering doesn't hire fools. The riders reached the mouth of the defile and pulled up. Mitchell raised a hand and the group halted. He scanned the terrain, his instincts clearly screaming that something was wrong. They know we're here, Grady murmured. Or they suspect. A shout echoed in the still mountain air. James Drayton, I know you're in there. It was Mitchell. Your friends at the lookout post went quiet. That means they're dead, and you're on the run. Fine. We can do this the hard way. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. You have something that belongs to Mr. Kettering. That ledger you stole from his private office. He wants it back. Come on out now. Hand it over, and maybe we let you live. Might even let your friends live. Keep running, and I guarantee you won't make it off this mountain alive. Silence fell over the canyon. Eveline could hear the thumping of her own heart, the whisper of wind through the rocks, the nervous stamp of a horse's hoof. The marshal's voice was a low whisper to her companions. I'm going to identify myself. It might make them back down, or it might force their hand. Either way, be ready. She rose slowly, keeping her hands visible and her marshal's badge held high. Cole Mitchell, this is Federal Marshal Elizabeth Grady. You and your men are in violation of federal law. Turn around and ride out, and I'll forget I saw you. You press this, you'll hang for interfering with a federal investigation. Mitchell's face darkened. He spat on the ground. Federal Marshal? Well, now that does complicate things. He glanced at the men with him, then seemed to reach a decision. But here's the thing, Marshal. You're alone, a long way from any help, in territory where Kettering's word is the only law that matters. Maybe you're the one who should ride on out. I can't do that. James Drayton is under federal protection. The evidence he carries is key to an ongoing investigation. Anyone who tries to take it will be charged with obstruction and accessory to murder. Strong words for a woman who's outnumbered. Mitchell's hand drifted toward his revolver. Last chance, Marshal. Ride away. Leave Drayton and the ledger. Live to see another sunrise. I can't do that either. Mitchell nodded slowly, unsurprised. Your funeral? His hand dropped for his gun, the signal his men were waiting for. But the marshal was faster. Her Colt cleared its leather, barking once before Mitchell's was even free. The shot spun him half around, clutching a bloody shoulder. And then the canyon erupted in chaos. Gunfire roared, echoing off the rock walls as bullets whined and ricocheted. Horses screamed and reared. Eveline sighted on the nearest rider, fired, and watched him clutch his chest as he toppled from the saddle. Tobias's rifle boomed twice, methodically dropping another man. James, using his one good hand, fired with deliberate calm, his shots finding their mark despite his injuries. One of Kettering's men spurred his horse into the mouth of the defile, trying to break their defensive position. Marshal Grady's rifle cracked, and the horse went down, pitching its rider hard against the rocks. The man didn't get up. Mitchell, despite his wounded shoulder, had taken cover behind a boulder and was returning fire with deadly accuracy. A bullet hissed past Eveline's head, so close she felt the wind of its passage. She ducked lower, her hands trembling as she reloaded. We can't hold them here, Tobias yelled over the din. Too many of them. Too much open ground behind us. There's a game trail, James grunted, already moving despite the agony it caused him. On the north wall. Narrow, but it leads up and over. We can get above them. You can't climb in your condition, Eveline protested. I can, and I will. His eyes, fierce and determined, met hers. I didn't survive 10 years in these mountains to die in some god-forsaken gulch. Follow me. Stay close, and keep your heads down. He led them to a nearly invisible cleft in the canyon wall. More a vertical crack than a proper trail. Marshal Grady went first, her rifle slung, scrambling up with the practiced ease of one used to rough country. Tobias followed, then Eveline. James came last, using his good arm and sheer stubbornness to haul himself up, his injured leg dragging behind. Below them, Kettering's men realized what was happening. Mitchell's voice, raw with fury, bellowed, "They're going up! Cut them off!" Bullets hammered the rock around them, sending stone chips flying. Eveline pressed herself flat against the cliff face, her heart pounding. The exposure was terrifying. One well-placed shot, and any of them could be sent tumbling to their death. But James knew this land. The crack opened onto a narrow ledge that ran along the canyon wall, hidden from below by an overhang. They scrambled onto it, panting and bleeding from a dozen small cuts, but alive. From this vantage point, they could see Kettering's remaining men below, 4 of them now, including the wounded Mitchell, spreading out, trying to find an angle to fire up at their prey. Marshal Grady settled herself at the edge of the ledge, her rifle ready. They're pinned down now. We have the high ground, and they can't reach us without exposing themselves completely. So we wait them out? Tobias asked. Or we end this, James said quietly. He looked down at Mitchell, and Eveline saw something cold and hard in his expression, the look of a man who had been hunted too long and was tired of running. This ends now, he shouted, his voice carrying down into the canyon. You want the ledger? Come and get it. Mitchell looked up, his face a mask of rage and pain from his shoulder. You can't stay up there forever, Drayton. And when you come down, we'll be waiting. Maybe, James called back. Or maybe I just toss the book off the cliff right now. Let it fall where none of us can ever reach it. Kettering goes free, but at least he doesn't get his evidence back to destroy. James pulled the oilcloth-wrapped book from his coat. He must have grabbed it from the saddlebag before they climbed. He held it out over the sheer drop. 15 years of Kettering's crimes, he called out. Everything he's done, everyone he's killed, all in his own hand. If this goes over the edge, it lands in a river 300 feet down. You'll never get it back. Neither will he. I've lived with my mistakes for 15 years. I can live with one more. Can Kettering live knowing his secrets might still surface someday? That copies might exist? That he'll spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder? It was a bluff, Eveline realized with a jolt. James had told the marshal it was the only original copy. But Mitchell didn't know that, and the uncertainty was plain on his face. "What do you want?" Mitchell finally yelled, his voice tight with frustration. "You and your men ride out. Leave your weapons and go. Do that, and the ledger is safe. Press this fight, and I let it drop, and we all lose." Mitchell stared at his remaining men, weighing his reputation against Kettering's wrath, the certainty of failure against the possibility of salvaging something. Finally, he spat on the ground and holstered his pistol. "This isn't over, Drayton. Kettering will find you. He always does. Let him try. I'm done hiding." Mitchell and his men dropped their rifles and revolvers, mounted their horses, and rode out of the defile, the slow slump of defeat in their every line. Marshal Grady kept her rifle trained on them until they were out of sight. Only then did she lower her weapon, letting out a long, slow breath. She looked at James. "That," she said, "was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I have ever seen." James just carefully pulled the ledger back from the edge and tucked it safely away. His hands were trembling. It was probably both the adrenaline and the fear. They made their way carefully down from the ledge, retrieved their horses, and rode into the canyon as the last of the light bled from the sky. No one spoke. The fierce rush of survival was draining away, leaving a bone-deep exhaustion and the stark reality of what they had just endured. Eveline rode alongside James, watching him fight simply to stay in the saddle. His face was a pale, drawn mask of pain and fatigue. He needed a doctor, proper rest, safety. They all did. But they were alive. Against all odds that screamed they should be dead, they had survived. And they had the ledger, the key to finally bringing Roland Kettering to justice, to ending the shadow that had loomed over their lives for 15 years. As they rode on, into the deepening gloom, Eveline reached out, her fingers briefly brushing his. He glanced at her, his expression one of surprise, and in the faint light, she saw the glint of unshed tears in his eyes. "We'll talk," she said, her voice low. "About everything. All of it. But not tonight. Tonight, we just need to get somewhere safe." He gave a small nod, unable to speak, and together, they rode on into the night. 3 weeks later, they sat on the veranda of her home, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The view was the same one she had known for 20 years, but nothing else was. James sat in the chair beside her, his injured leg propped on a stool, healing slowly but surely. A skilled doctor in Denver had cleaned and stitched the infected wound, reset his dislocated shoulder, and declared that with proper rest, he would make a full recovery.